In many ways, the most creative, challenging, and underappreciated aspect of interaction design is evaluating designs with people. The insights that you'll get from testing designs with people can help you get new ideas, make changes, decide wisely, and fix bugs. One reason I think design is such an interesting field is its relationship to truth and objectivity. I find design so incredibly fascinating because we can say more in response to a question like, how can we measure success? Than it's just personal preference or whatever feels right. At the same time, the answers are more complex and more open-ended, more subjective, and require more wisdom than just a number like 7 or 3. One of the things that we're going to learn in this class is the different kinds of knowledge that you can get out of different kinds of methods. Why evaluate designs with people? Why learn about how people use interactive systems? I think one major reason for this is that it can be difficult to tell how good a user interface is until you've tried it out with actual users. And that's because clients and designers and developers, they may know too much about the domain and the user interface, or have acquired blinders through designing and building the user interface. At the same time, they may not know enough about the user's actual tasks. And while experience in theory can help, it can still be hard to predict what real users will actually do. You might want to know, can people figure out how to use it? Or do they swear or giggle when using this interface? How does this design compare to that design? And if we change the user interface, how does that change people's behavior? What new practices might emerge? How do things change over time? These are all great questions to ask about an interface, and each will come from different methods. The value of having a broad toolbox of different methods can be especially valuable in emerging areas like mobile and social software, where people's use practices can be particularly context-dependent and also evolve significantly over time in response to how other people use software through network effects and things like that. To give you a flavor of this, I'd like to quickly run through some common types of empirical research in HCI. The examples I'll show are mostly published work of one sort or another, because that's the easiest stuff to share. If you have good examples from current systems out in the world, post them to the forum. I keep an archive of user interface examples, and I and the other students would love to see what you can come up with. One way to learn about the user experience of a design is to bring people into your lab or office and have them try it out. We often call these usability studies. This watch someone use my interface approach is a common one in HCI. This basic strategy for traditional user-centered design is to iteratively bring people into your lab or office until you run out of time and then release. And if you had deep pockets, these rooms had a one-way glass mirror and the development team was on the other side. In a leaner environment, this may be just bringing people into your dorm room or office. You'll learn a huge amount by doing this. Every single time that I or a student friend or colleague has watched somebody new use a new interactive system, we've learned something. As designers, we get blinders to systems' quirks, bugs, and false assumptions. However, there are some major shortcomings with this approach. In particular, the setting probably isn't very ecologically valid. In the real world, people may have different tasks, goals, motivations, and physical settings than your office or lab. This can be especially true for interfaces that you think people might use on the go, like at a bus stop or while waiting in line. Second, there can be a please the experimenter bias, where when you bring somebody in to try out a user interface, they know that they're trying out the technology that you developed, and so they may work harder or be nicer than they would if they had to use it without the constraints of a lab setup with the person who developed it watching right over them. Third, in its most basic form, where you're trying out just one user interface, there's no comparison point. So while you can track when people laugh or swear or smile with joy, you won't know whether they would have laughed more or sworn less or smiled more if you'd had a different user interface. And finally, it requires bringing people to your physical location. This is often a whole lot easier than people think, but it can be a psychological burden even if nothing else. A very different way of getting feedback from people is to use a survey. Here's an example of a survey I got recently from San Francisco asking about different streetlight designs. Surveys are great because you can quickly get feedback from a large number of responses, and it's relatively easy to compare multiple alternatives. You can also automatically tally the results. You don't even need to build anything, you can just show screenshots or mock-ups. One of the things that I've learned the hard way, though, is the difference between what people say they're going to do and what they actually do. Ask people how often they exercise, and you'll probably get a much more optimistic answer than how often they really do exercise. The same holds for the streetlight example here. Trying to imagine what a number of different streetlight designs might be is really different than actually observing them on the street and having them become part of normal everyday life. Still, it can be valuable to get feedback. Another type of respondent strategy is focus groups. In a focus group, you'll gather together a small group of people to discuss a design or idea. The fact that focus groups involve a group of people is a double-edged sword. On one hand, you can get people to tease out of their colleagues things that they might not have thought to say on their own. On the other hand, for a variety of psychological reasons, people may be inclined to say polite things or generate answers completely on the spot that are totally uncorrelated with what they actually believe or what they would actually do. Focus groups can be a particularly problematic method when you're looking at trying to gather data about taboo topics or about cultural biases. With those caveats, right now we're just making a laundry list, and I think that focus groups, like almost any other method, can play an important role in your tool belt. Our third category of techniques is to get feedback from experts. For example, in this class, we're going to do a bunch of peer critique for your weekly project assignments. In addition to having users try your interface, it can be important to eat your own dog food and use the tools that you build yourself. When you're getting feedback from experts, it can often be helpful to have some kind of structured format, much like the rubrics that you'll see in your project assignments. And for getting feedback on user interfaces, one common approach to this structured feedback is called heuristic evaluation, and you'll learn how to do that in this class. It was pioneered by Jakob Nielsen. Our next genre is comparative experiments, taking two or more distinct options and comparing their performance to each other. These comparisons can take place in lots of different ways. They can be in the lab, they can be in the field, they can be online. These experiments can be more or less controlled, and they can take place over shorter or longer durations. What you're trying to learn here is which option is the more effective, and more often, what are the active ingredients, what are the variables that matter in creating the user experience that you seek. Here's an example. My former PhD student Joel Brandt and his colleagues at Adobe ran a number of studies comparing help interfaces for programmers. In particular, they compared a more traditional search-style user interface for finding programming help with a search interface that integrated programming help directly into your environment. By running these comparisons, they were able to see how programmers' behavior differed based on the changing help user interface. Comparative experiments have an advantage over surveys in that you get to see the actual behavior as opposed to self-report, and they can be better than usability studies because you're comparing multiple alternatives. This enables you to see what works better or worse, or at least what works different. I find that comparative feedback is also often much more actionable. However, if you're running controlled experiments online, you don't get to see much about the person that's on the other side of the screen. And if you're inviting people into your office or lab, the behavior you're measuring might not be very realistic. If realistic longitudinal behavior is what you're after, participant observation may be the approach for you. This approach is just what it sounds like, observing what people actually do in their actual work environment. And this more long-term evaluation can be important for uncovering things that you might not see in shorter-term, more controlled scenarios. For example, my colleagues Bob Sutton and Andrew Hargadon studied brainstorming. The prior literature on brainstorming had focused mostly on questions like, do people come up with more ideas? What Bob and Andrew realized by going into the field was that brainstorming served a number of other functions also, like, for example, brainstorming provides a way for members of a design team to demonstrate their creativity to their peers. It allows them to pass along knowledge that can then be reused in other projects. And it creates a fun, exciting environment that people like to work in and that clients like to participate in. In a real ecosystem, all of these things are important, in addition to just how many ideas do people come up with. Nearly all experiments seek to build a theory on some level. I don't mean anything fancy by this, just that we take some things to be more relevant and other things to be less relevant. We might, for example, assume that the ordering of search results may play an important role in what people click on, but that the batting average of the Detroit Tigers doesn't, unless, of course, somebody's searching for baseball. If you have a theory that's sufficiently formal mathematically that you can make predictions, then you can compare alternative interfaces using that model without having to bring people in. and we'll go over that in this class a little bit with respect to input models. This makes it possible to try out a number of alternatives really fast. Consequently, when people use simulations, it's often in conjunction with something like Monte Carlo optimization. One example of this can be found in the ShapeWriter system, where Shuman Zhai and colleagues figured out how to build a keyboard where people could enter an entire word in a single stroke. They were able to do this with the benefit of formal models and optimization-based approaches. Simulation has mostly been used for input techniques because people's motor performance is probably the most well-quantified area of HCI. And while we won't get to it much in this intro course, simulation can also be used for higher-level cognitive tasks. For example, Pete Paroli and colleagues at PARC have built impressive models of people's web surfing behavior. These models enabled them to estimate, for example, which link somebody is most likely to click on by looking at the relevant link text. So that's our whirlwind tour of a number of different empirical methods that this class will introduce. You'll want to pick the right method for the right task, and here are some issues to consider. If you did it again, would you get the same thing? Another is generalizability and realism. Does this hold for people other than 18-year-old upper-middle-class students who are doing this for course credit or a gift certificate? Is this behavior also what you'd see in the real world, or only in a more stilted lab environment? Comparisons are important because they can tell you how the user experience would change with different interface choices, as opposed to just a people liked it study. It's also important to think about how to achieve these insights efficiently and not chew up a lot of resources, especially when your goal is practical. My experience as a designer, researcher, teacher, consultant, advisor, and mentor has taught me that evaluating designs with people is both easier and more valuable than many people expect. And there's an incredible light bulb moment that happens when you actually get designs in front of people and see how they use them. So to sum up this video, I'd like to ask what's maybe the most important question. What do you want to learn?